So I can understand if you're a right-wing American populist celebrating Trump's victory. That to me makes absolute total sense. What doesn't make sense to me is where you see populist right-wingers like Nigel Farage cheering on, Donald Trump's win, or someone in France who's exact same persuasion, Germany, etc., etc. Because here's the thing, guys. Trump doesn't care. His entire agenda, whether it be the Project 2025 agenda or the America First think tank, has one very clear and stated aim. In fact, it's in the title, as Trump has repeated many, many times, America First. Where does this leave, Europe? It leaves it last. Trump is going to do nothing for you. He owes you no favors. He will do nothing special for you. Doesn't matter if you're of the same political persuasion. He didn't really do anything for these populist leaders last time. Why is he suddenly going to be doing the same for them this time? Of course, many are at least hoping is that their electoral success now relies on Trump. And of course, when the Trump White House inevitably erupts into flames, as it pretty much is right now and will do in the coming years, people are going to be thinking very, very differently, because we saw what happened last time, that Trump's White House reflected very, very negatively on a lot of other populist movements throughout Europe. It is probably going to have the same effect as well. And yet here we are dipping our toes into UnHerd. And oh boy, I think we've talked about UnHerd before. UnHerd is weird. It's mad. It's bizarre. It's crazy. If you thought we've seen some comedy on Conservative Home over the years, UnHerd is like insanity. And we're going to experience some of that today. So, let's dive into this then, shall we? So, taking our first trip to UnHerd. I'm sure we've been covered UnHerd before. This might be our first trip. I know I've talked about UnHerd, but I'm not sure how we covered it, if we very rarely covered it before. But this one definitely deserves to be covered this time around. So, before we go jumping on into this, please do remember to check out the Patreon page down below, the Buy Me Coffee link as well, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button as well down below, and of course there's the Pony Club and the Patreon page down below as well. If you'd like to help support the channel that way, you can do so, or you can click the like and share button. It all helps. So let's dip our toes in then to UnHerd. Oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy. America First leaves Europe last. Populists should dump DC. So, let's dive into this then, shall we? False and dangerous. Deeply concerning. A neo-Nazi sympathizing psychopath. Many of Europe's leaders have been, quote, regretting their previous criticisms of Donald Trump. From Donald Tusk to David Lammy, the bloc's liberals have now rushed to offer their very stiff congratulations to a newly announced president-elect. Meanwhile, the leaders of Italy and Hungary have now raced to kiss the ring of America's godfather of populism. Bear in mind, if you have made comments about Trump in the past, it is basic diplomacy to say, congratulations. We've got to work together now. I've said this before, even when it came out that Lammy has met with Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago. You've got to. You can't just ignore who's in the White House. You've got to acknowledge them. You can't just ignore America for the next 4 years, as much as some of us would like to. We can't. That's just the relationship of international politics. Yeah, As he continues, if there is one thing that does unite Trump's sycophants and the skeptics, of course, in Europe, is now the desire to boost European defense, spreading, and security of cooperation. In this very nervily displayed of the Franco-German solidarity, the leaders, of course, France and Germany, announced that they would now work together to build a more united, stronger, more sovereign Europe in this context, with an emphasis now of enhancing European defence. In Britain, we have seen calls for Prime Minister Keir Starmer to now draw closer to Europe on security, deepening now a Brexit betrayal initiated by Boris Johnson. I love this because, remember, UnHerd is like the more insane version of Conservative Home. And where Boris Johnson, as we've seen before in the past, has been treated as almost this messianic figure on UnHerd, as you can see right here, Boris Johnson treated as Brexit betrayer numero uno in this case. But of course, we work on this because Trump has made many, many things and statements about NATO. And this has got many people in Europe worried. This is why European reliance on America has now been very much questioned. They need to build their own European, defense infrastructure that is completely now separate of that from America, because we don't know if let's say Article 5 got triggered by Russia, would Trump respond? He doesn't necessarily have to. This is now making people, a lot of Europe, be very serious, and they are taking these questions of defense very seriously, especially as we have seen what has gone on in Ukraine. There is a reason why NATO expanded. There is a reason why everyone has increased defense spending, and you are probably going to see increased defense spending, more defense cooperation across the board. It is not a Brexit betrayal to going forward and work with Europe on these issues, because guess what? We are a European country as well. What goes on in Europe affects us a heck of a lot. So yes, we in the UK should absolutely care about European defense concerns. It is not a betrayal. So for liberals, again, you can tell where this is going straight away. Strengthening, of course, the EU and NATO will ensure against Trump either now withdrawing from the defensive alliance, whose European members he views as a parasitical free riders, or giving up on the Ukraine war effort. For populists, the great defense spending is, of course, at least an act of fealty, symbolizing their devotion to Trump's new world order. And what about NATO? What about if Trump did stop spending? The consequences of what that would be. Anyway, either way, Europeans would be very mistaken, of course, to respond to Trump 2.0 by either doubling down on the transatlantic alliance or even European integration. What Trump victory has shown is the globalist strategy of pursuing transnational integration against the wishes of voters has failed. No, it hasn't. Absolutely has not. If you look at polling of what the favorability rating of the EU is across Europe, it is massively above 60%, even more in some other countries. The idea and saying that this integration has failed, which, bear in mind, Europe is really only integrated really on a lot of trade stuff, not anything really political. Again, you still see a lot of the Euroscepticism stuff, even not only today, but even still in other countries, trying to sort of push against this. And remember, many of these people who wanted to see Brexit succeed, Geert Wilders, Marie Le Pen, the second they saw how Brexit failed, they dropped leaving Europe as quickly as they could. Instead, they've now changed their tune that they want to say roll back integration, not actually leave it, which is a fundamental change of their position. And that is because of Brexit. And in fact, it would even hurt them even more if Britain came back into the EU. It would defeat their argument even more if that were to happen. But anyway, let's get back to this. So what Trump's victory shows is that the globalist elite strategy, the pursuing transnational has failed. So with this America First agenda, the president-elect has now bet twice on America's voters over his globalist elites. Who all just happen to support Donald Trump. Yeah, totally. All these globalist elites just happen to support Donald Trump. Of course, and won both times. In light of this, Europe's leaders, again, didn't win. He was lost once, but there you go. In the light of this, Europe's leaders would commit a very grave error in choosing NATO over their own people. NATO helps defend their own people. Like, fundamentally, the NATO alliance is all these countries coming together, and we will say, we will help defend you should you be attacked. Like, that helps. Like, that literally is like us being part of NATO is saying if France is attacked, UK will help, France. We will help Belgium. We will help the Netherlands. We will help Finland. We will help Sweden. Name your NATO country. We will help them. That is us protecting their citizens as well. That does not denigrate their safety, especially when it comes to defense concerns. It only enhances their strength. Because Poland should be rest assured that should, Putin decide, well, actually, that part was, historically Russia, so, that's mine now. They know that the RAF will be coming to their aid, that there will be RAF planes in the sky helping to defend their citizens. Like, NATO enhances that strength, that protection of Polish citizens, as it would for any other NATO country, as it also would for UK citizens as well. We would see, French, German planes, over the skies, using, RAF bases here to patrol the North Sea, Atlantic, etc. This guy's thinking on these internationalist, organizations completely is pants on head moments. Anyway, so there was, of course, once a time when European economic and security integration may have had a strategic rationale in the post-Cold War unipolar world. Globalization was underpinned by American hegemony and economic strength. Why does it have to be underpinned by that? Why can't it be dependent on European economic strength? Why can't it be guaranteed through European defensive strength? This is why people are asking for European, defensive, own integration of making sure that we are free from any potential American needs and wants. This is how we've looked at it. This is what all of Europe is now reacting to. And we're probably going to see these efforts more. This is why Starmer probably went to see Macron, with rumors talking them about if Trump were to remove American nuclear weapons from Europe, there are talks, and we've talked about this before on the channel, would we have to, as well with France, extend our own nuclear umbrella, meaning that the rest of Europe then gets protected by those weapons, rather than them having to Germany pursue its own, nuclear weapons, meaning that there's more nuclear weapons out there, more nuclear proliferation, Germany doesn't have to worry because it knows that there are France and UK nuclear weapons that are going to protect it should worst come to worst. And that nuclear umbrella will be that will extend to them as well. Yeah, sorry, this guy knows I think very little about foreign policy, other than his own crazy worldview. So back to this then. So back then, American globalism provided the cover for European integration, allowing the European elites to detach themselves from their voters. What? I would love to see what this guy actually thought what a European elite actually was and how they have, quote, detached themselves from their voters. Workers were promised all the glories of globalization in return for retreating from politics to lives of cozy consumption. Again, that never happened. That was not what the promise was made. This is, of course, right-wing populist nonsense. This protest then opened up the void now of between citizens and the political elites that has now bedeviled the European states ever since. No, there is no void between citizens, political elites. Remember, this guy would ultimately probably be in favor of the Conservative Party. They are massively out of touch with certainly the British citizens. Even Nigel Farage, even though he claims to be in touch with, the Clacton citizens, yet he's barely spent any time in Clacton. So far, what has Nigel Farage done for Clacton? Absolutely nothing. He's barely even been there. So that world is now long gone. But Europe isn't. Integration isn't. That is still there. Anyway, he continues. The high tide of economic globalization has now receded. No, it hasn't. The political globalization is edging with it. No, it hasn't. Today, China is the industrial workshop of the world, and America is no longer its hegemon. Really? Who's challenging America for this hegemon? Russia, who we were told was meant to be like a peer-to-peer military with America. Given what's going on in Ukraine, I don't think that's the case. There's rumors that China's military is in just as bad state. Bear in mind, I don't think they are being challenged. I think that the problem that we are seeing is isolationism become once again the order of the day in America, which is going to have bad consequences because it means America is no longer going to play on the world stage. This now means that countries like us, and in Europe in particular, now has to come together and even integrate more because of this. Because America, who knows what it's going to do? But it ain't going to get involved in anything unless it serves its interest. So this means that further now European or even transatlantic integration through NATO has become a losing strategy. No, it hasn't. Say what you want about the 2024 election that took place, and obviously Trump won. Harris did not lose that election because of NATO, nor through European integration. I'm sorry, this guy has no clue what he's talking about. No clue. This is ultimate waffle. This is the biggest waffle burger I think I've ever seen. But again, this is what passes for our articles on UnHerd. So, rather than, of course, uniting against Trump or even sticking up to him, Europe should now seek to replicate his domestic political model. What? What does that even mean? What does that even mean? Replicating the Trump domestic political. What does that even mean? As Trump did, of course, in the US, European nationals should now build electoral coalitions for national renewal. and use this as a basic basis to forge new international relationships in place of old transnational ones. So what? You get rid of transnational relationships in order to replace them with new transnational relationships. What is he on about? Anyway, there are plenty, of course, reasons to avoid further European integration. No, they're not. If anything, Trump has also sped up more European integration on this, whether it is via the EU or NATO. But several do stand out. First of all, Trump's foreign policy focus will be on China and the Asia Pacific more than Europe, which will increasingly take place in Washington's geopolitical calculus. Yeah, so why then, as we as Europeans, if Trump is not going to care about our security concerns, why then should we care about Washington's? Why then should we care about his beef with either China or stuff that goes on in the Asia Pacific? If Trump is not going to care about us, why should we care about his? And this should be something that gets brought up all the time. We have no interest. If Trump does not have an interest in our security defense concerns, we should have zero concerns of what goes on with his. And that's how it should be. That is how it will be diplomatically. No amount of course Trump whispering from Giorgia Meloni or even Viktor Orban will change that. Second, to push for further European integration in response to US strategic retreat from Europe will not strengthen the continent. How would it not strengthen the continent? If you saw a American retreat, a US strategic retreat from Europe, and you saw a European growth in defense industry and defense spending, an increase in defense treaties and etc., how would that not strengthen the continent? I'm flabbergasted that this guy wrote that with a straight face, but there you go. This is unheard. I did say it's bizarre, but anyway, let's find out how it wouldn't. So he says quite the opposite. It will bolster the transatlantic structures that weaken the nations of Europe. The transnational structures, what are these transnational structures? How would it weaken European defense? It's worth reminding you that on UnHerd, they refer to these people as their intellectual artillery. Yeah, this guy's firing blanks. I can tell you that so far. Yeah, if this is intellectual artillery, I'd be quite happy to walk into this artillery storm because I can guarantee you none of his shells are going to explode. So let's continue on this. So the EU functions by leeching power from the nation state without subordinating it now to any greater political authority. Again, absolute nonsense. No, countries are still very much sovereign. Within that, are there things that these EU countries have to follow? Yes, people vote for MEPs. Guess what? There's your political stability. The only reason people like this completely understand this is because they do not actually understand how the EU works, because they've got no interest in how the EU works, because if they did, it would undermine their years of arguments of Euroscepticism if they ever bothered to learn how it worked. So with no institutional core, The EU functions as a political pinball machine, ricocheting from responsibility from one supranational agency to another, from one country to another. There is no military function within the EU. Fundamentally misunderstanding it. If anything, what it is, it's going to be countries increasing their defense spending and working more within NATO. That is what is going to be strengthened here. That is the organization you should be taking pot shots at, not the EU. Now, if the EU, oh, actually, we're going to sort of really develop more, defense, industry spending. We're going to do more, maybe look at subsidies, have some more homegrown European, defense industry structures. Even then, that is not what will mainly be leading any potential fights. It will be the NATO infrastructure, the military infrastructure built through that, and the cooperation through that, which will be guiding it. At best, the EU will probably provide factories, subsidies, etc., to help that. But you are fundamentally misunderstanding the EU as it is structurally is at this moment in time. If this is your takeaway from it, you are fundamentally flawed about not only NATO, how that works, but also the EU. This guy is an idiot. So this structure admittedly now worked for it again. Oh, it worked for a time. Gee, I wonder why it worked for a time. But with only, of course, the US now hovering in the background. Again, European defense thought had been for years relying on the US. Congratulations on that. Throughout the era of unipolar globalization, Washington was now ready to come to the aid of European states when necessary. America often offered leadership during European military campaigns against Yugoslavia in the 90s and Libya in 2010. For instance, it oversaw the European financial crisis in the 2010s through the International Monetary Fund. Today, with Trump looking east, America will be less willing to lend a hand. And International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is international. Yes, it is based in America, but why is the MIF not going to get involved if there is a financial crash in Europe where it would thinks it would be good to step in? Like, I'm sorry, I'm flabbergasted. This guy writes this with a straight face. I am shocked he thinks he can write this with a straight face, because that is the biggest load of nonsense I've ever heard. If there was a financial crash in America, oh, sorry, in Europe, the IMF would step in to help Europe. It wouldn't, quote, look east. And then, bear in mind, if Trump did that, what's then to stop the Europeans setting up their own European Monetary Fund to counteract the IMF? Because I thought BRICS was meant to be this big anti-counter to the IMF. But BRICS has done nothing, still has done nothing, and not really proved to be a counter or even a true alternative to the IMF. But there you go. Anyway, nor will, of course, the strengthening of NATO be much use in Trump world. This will only reinforce the Europeans' geopolitical divide. What? How is that going to? How is the strengthening of Europe and NATO going to divide Europe? So, from which the US ultimately profits? Potentially not, because if these tariffs do come into effect, that will also affect military equipment, military essential, capabilities, parts, and components, which then will force European countries to either go to those those American defense contractors, say, come and open factories here, or it will become a strategic necessity for these countries to then open factories in Europe, which means European will benefit from that. Anyway, just consider, of course, the war in Ukraine. As long as the EU and Russia are, at odds, the EU, of course, will remain dependent on importing more expensive US liquid natural gas. It's not just US. Norway has massively benefited from this as well, but also we are seeing Europe massively really run now into greening a lot of their own energy supplies. There's talk, very, very much so, which we are probably going to get involved with as well, of turning the North Sea into a massive green energy power plant. And that is possible. That is something that is eminently doable with Europe. Now, we've already done a video about that, but again, doesn't seem to even realize what's going on in Europe as well. Yes. Anyway. It will, of course, continue to act as a drag on European industry and growth. Meanwhile, Russia will remain focused heavily on supplying energy markets outside Europe. Yeah, how well is that going for them? Not very well at all, because they're having to sell it cut price to China, which again is not making them money. OPEC is looking like it is going to make moves against Russia potentially as well, which will further damage their market on that as well. So yeah, good luck to them when that happens, because that's looking like that could happen soon. Relying, of course, even more heavily on Chinese imports to supply its industrial equipment. That would, of course, is a world that now favors the Chinese and American firms over European ones. No, it really doesn't. Why? That is not even a that does not even justify them doing that. I'm sorry, I am sort of very flabbergasted as how we could argue and make that case. Why are they relying on either Chinese or American firms? Why not European ones, where European firms can do what the Chinese and American firms make? Again, randomly, European companies and European industry just going to be abandoned en masse. Because growth. What growth? Growth in what? And then you're assuming that Europe just does nothing, that these countries in Europe just do nothing. They're just going to sit there and do nothing. Because the big argument from people like this, these anti-Eurosceptics, or shall we say these very, very anti-European Eurosceptics, is that Europe is stagnating. And that's why we had to leave it. That's why we have to go elsewhere. It's not. It's because Europe really, as everywhere else, is a developed economy. It is incredibly hard to make that line go up any further. But they are growing. They are doing very well. They have very robust, active economies. But of course, not to people like this, because this guy ultimately is a free market fundamentalist. And as far as he is concerned, if line does not go up, that is a bad economy. So let's continue. Let's try and finish this off then, shall we? So if Trump's foreign policy follows the direction of his first administration, then we can expect at least a renewal of focus on building more transnational international orders. Bilateral bargaining now for regional orders are far more likely than the starry-eyed globalist counterparts. To bargain effectively in such a world, European nations must develop a very clear sense of their own national interests. Really, why would a country like France abandon the EU in search of its own national interest, where together, combined with Europe and the European industrial might, and power and the financial, just all the markets. Why would it do that? Europe has proved time and time again it works on this. That it is not only that, it is a direct competitor to America, to China in these. Why is France just need to say we are going it alone? Why is Belgium suddenly going to decide we are going it alone? um, so, and of course, these new national interests now mean looking inward, not outward. This means turning away from the faded promises of globalism. What are those promises? He never talks about these. What are these problems that globalism is bringing to these countries? Why are they going to look inward to solve some of these problems? He doesn't explain any of this because I don't think he has the answers. This is populist rhetoric cranked up to the max. So, for this reason, renew calls for transnational integration, whether even the European or Atlantic vary, completely missed the mark. No, it's not. You've completely missed the mark on this. You've pretty much shown it. You completely misunderstand NATO, how the EU works, pretty much how foreign policy would develop through some of your potential situations you've laid out here. Again, I'm not too impressed when you are considered to be, again, one of the intellectual artillery pieces for unheard on this. So the alarm response, of course, European liberals to Trump's victory. It's not just liberals that are responding to this; it's conservative ones as well. How do you, for example, make of the fact that Conservative Home, one of their former editor, pretty much said recently to Kimmy Badnock, "Please shut up talking about a US trade deal." How do you feel about that? So Trump's victory does, of course, reveal the fear not only of Trump, but of course their own voters. No, it doesn't. The reason they fear Trump is because they know he is something that they lack: national demographic legitimacy, built on the wishes of the marginalized and the politically excluded. Again, that's right-wing talk if I've ever heard it before. The European liberal elites do feel trapped between the mercurial Trump and their own now left behind deplorables. It's not fundamentally Europe is going to have to sort of deal with that, and you are seeing parties respond to that very slowly, yes, in Europe, but they are responding to it. By contrast, of course, European populists have now embraced Trump as leader of their global movement. Yet, this is also very ill advised. Rather than turning to Washington for leadership, populist leaders will be far better off learning from the Trump playbook, appealing to their own fellow citizens rather than parading around with NATO banners, jockeying for an international position. This is the paradox of the Trump world. The only way to build a new era of international cooperation is to start again from within through a project of national renewal. Yeah, I'm sorry. This guy doesn't understand why start again when you've already got these structures in place. Like what do these structures currently do that they don't provide already? I'm sorry, there is no area, there is no aim where these structures do not provide anything that you are currently arguing for or against. It is completely absolute fantasy of what this guy is arguing for. I have never seen such a misplaced faith in international politics and how international politics works. And bear in mind, I am a layman when it comes to this. I will admit that. I will freely admit that. But even I think from this probably have a better understanding of how NATO and European works compared to this guy, where he somehow thinks that Europe is or at least the EU is a military power. It's not. It's an economic one. NATO is a military power. It's a military alliance. EU currently at the moment is very, very much a far more economical one. If it wants to become a military one, it can do. If the European countries want that, methinks there might be talks about having that. But at the moment, NATO does fulfill and tick a lot of those boxes that they're looking for. So there's really no need to do that in Europe when you already have sort of NATO. You know, European strategic autonomy is becoming, I think, a big question a lot of these countries are going to be looking at, are going to be sort of focusing on. And I don't think it's going to go the way this guy says. Not one bit. Not one bit. So, again, why on earth would you destroy something only to sort of rebuild it? And then why then work with an internationalist organization when you are, and this guy clearly advocates for, looking inward, not outward? Why then care what goes beyond the borders of your nation at that point? What's the point in even rebuilding these international orders if you've destroyed them? I'm sorry, that is terrible. This is why I don't cover unheard very often, because it just leaves me very angry and annoyed. But yeah, uh, the intellectual artillery of unheard, everyone. Um, yeah. So as always, let me know what you think down below, and as always, we'll see you all next time.